We are animals, Negan. Civilization is a myth. That is the truth this world has taught us. We have not risen above our baser instincts. This is what always has, and always will, drive us. The Walking Dead is a survival horror drama television show based on Robert Kirkman's comic book series of the same name. It follows the story of Rick Grimes, who awakens from a month-long coma to a world ravaged by flesh-eating monsters. He reunites with his wife, Lori, his son, Carl, and his best friend, Shane, and thus adapts to, and is shaped by, the tribulations of the post-apocalypse. Along the way, some people die while others lose their minds. Ultimately, the remaining survivors rally together to conquer the zombie epidemic and therefore rebuild society. But what if society never ended? What if the world is not any different from before Rick awakened from his coma? Much controversy surrounds the writer's decision to refrain from explaining the cause and nature of the zombie virus. It harkens back to a quote by Glenn Mazzara, original showrunner for The Walking Dead, who stated that, quote, "If you define what caused the outbreak, that puts us in a world of science fiction. And this isn't science fiction to me. It's horror. In my mind, that's two different genres. So that is an important distinction." End quote. To a large extent, the decision to withhold the true origins of the zombie outbreak is justifiable, as the whole point of The Walking Dead is to illustrate how people relate to, live amongst, and rule each other in an apocalyptic context. Think of it along these lines. When a profound calamity such as a war or viral epidemic takes away our technology, infrastructure, agriculture, and medicine, we are reduced down to animals just trying to survive in a hostile world. And yet, when we reintroduce these fabrics weaving society together, we remain animals just trying to survive in a hostile world, albeit more easily, less stressfully, and with fewer zombies. But you might be asking yourself, why think critically about The Walking Dead? The answer is because the zombie apocalypse can be used as a lens through which to examine our own lives and societies. That is, it explores issues of power, sanity, philosophy, community, and strength, posing thought-provoking questions such as, who gets to control us? How many traumatic, disillusioning experiences does it take before we want to give up? How do we attribute meaning to our lives? Why is man so inherently tribal and exclusionary? What are the implications of residing within our self-created comfort zones for too long? Through highlighting key pieces of dialogue and character interactions, I will discuss issues of power, sanity, philosophy, community, and strength in the following 5 segments to support the argument that we are already living in the apocalypse. For the purposes of this discussion, however, I will mainly focus on the television show, but don't be surprised if I reference the comic book series a couple of times to illustrate a point. Let's begin.
No takers? Fine. But get one thing straight. You're staying. This isn't a democracy anymore.
They say that all good television is an escape from politics, but when you really think about it, isn't all good television an emulation of politics? Just look at Game of Thrones, a show whose entire plot revolves around characters competing to sit on a glorified chair. Critics of The Walking Dead argue that, over the years, the show has become less focused on the survivalist aspect and more focused on the political aspect. I would go so far as to argue that, fundamentally, The Walking Dead has always been a show about politics, as it's really been the power struggles, or the conflicts between the human characters, that have constituted a large portion of its story. Of course, the zombies have always factored into the overarching narrative, but not nearly as much as you would assume. Some questions to consider before we start are, is power a matter of choice? Why might power be such a critical theme of The Walking Dead? Is power largely driven by ego and the desire for status and prominence? How do people rule over each other in the absence of laws, rules, and formal and informal sanctions? Who is worthy of wielding power? In other words, how do we decide who gets to lead us? Most importantly, what is power? Power is defined as the capacity to exercise authority upon others and coerce them into compliance with demands, expectations, and objectives. Let's break down this definition. First and foremost, authority can only be established on the basis of both the legitimacy and trustworthiness of the person who's assumed it. Legitimacy is your group's acceptance of your leader. For instance, Rick's followers almost unanimously agree that, on some level, he is competent and sensible enough to guide them through the infinite perils of the zombie apocalypse, and thus they accept him as their leader because they don't believe that anyone else is better suited for the job. There are three types of legitimacy that we use to categorize state leaders: charismatic, traditional, and rational legal legitimacy. They were introduced in an essay written by German philosopher and sociologist Max Weber, who believed that power is something that can only exist insofar as the willingness to accept it without protest. Charismatically legitimate leaders rule by projecting their personas in ways that are dubiously charming, yet create hope for the future, even if such hope is an illusion. I'll use the example of the governor, who admits to Rick in Season 3, Episode 13 that he was involuntarily entrusted to lead Woodbury because people believed that he could keep them safe. Traditionally legitimate leaders rule by upholding tradition. Essentially, it's the way society has always been. So why burden your followers with something as unnecessary as change? Presidents, prime ministers, kings, monarchs, dictators, and tribal leaders are all examples of traditionally legitimate leaders because the power they wield has been passed down from one generation to the next, wherein tradition is a righteous and acceptable way of governing. Meanwhile, Deanna Monroe is a traditionally legitimate leader in The Walking Dead. She derives her authority from her status as a once highly esteemed congresswoman, and as such, her followers accept her leadership because if she was a competent leader in the pre-apocalypse, then she must be a competent leader in the post-apocalypse. But we know from the Season 5 story arc where Rick and the survivors assimilate into the Alexandria safe zone that this logic is defective when we rely solely on the institution of tradition to transfer the mantle of power. Rick's arrival at Alexandria marks a dramatic shift in the community's power dynamics. At first, Deanna interviews each of the remaining survivors to assess the states of their mental health and take personality inventories. Immediately afterward, she finds work for them. Rick and Michonne are appointed as the local constables, Sasha as a guard, Maggie as Deanna's leading advisor, Father Gabriel as the priest, Abraham as a construction worker, Glenn as a runner for food and supplies, Daryl as a recruiter, Carol as a cook, and Noah as Reg's apprentice. Eventually, these survivors assume complete control over Alexandria, outmatching the other residents in their proficiency at combating walkers and generally exercising their leadership capabilities. In Season 5, Episode 14, Deanna laments to Maggie how
I put another one of your people in a position of power. You vouch for them. It's becoming a pattern.
Finally coming to grasp with the uncomfortable realization that she and the rest of her community have survived for this long simply because they have never had to face what's on the outside, or what's beyond those walls. By Season 6, Episode 1, a grief-struck Deanna no longer considers herself to be in the right mindset to lead Alexandria, and therefore relinquishes all power to Rick to deal with the impending herd of walkers. This makes him the official leader of Alexandria, and the de facto person to make all of the sensitive decisions for the community. A privilege that Deanna certainly reveled in beforehand, but is no longer suited to behold. Rational legal legitimate leaders rule by defending and enforcing a series of rigid rules that foster safety through complacency. These leaders refuse to compromise because a violation of the rules constitutes an attack on the very system that legitimizes them in the first place. Rational legal legitimacy is institutionalized through formal law and bureaucratic authority, and we can see stark parallels to this in the show. For example, the saviors recurrently talk about rules, rules, and more rules.
There are rules. The rules matter.
He broke the rules, so folks had to die.
In Season 7, Episode 7, Negan emphasizes that the goal of the Saviors is to bring civilization back to the world by providing security to others, but that they cannot function without rules. Therefore, depending on the nature and seriousness of the offense, such as attempting rape, dissenting from the sanctuary, or failing to provide 50% of resources on time and on schedule, the Saviors will either kill or inflict severe physical or psychological pain to reaffirm and attribute meaning to the necessity for rules in this new world order. So which type of leader is the most successful then? I'd say it's a combination of all three. We've seen that too much or too little of each type of legitimacy can be detrimental to long-term group stability. The governor, whose charisma supposedly propelled him to power, causes the destruction of Woodbury and the prison and impulsively murders his own people in cold blood. Deanna, whose experience in government prior to the zombie apocalypse creates false perceptions of competence, leads an incompetent community. Finally, Negan, whose brutal coercion tactics intimidate and traumatize people into subservience, incites an armed rebellion against him. Meanwhile, trustworthiness is your group's confidence in your leader. The truth is, Rick wouldn't have remained in power for this long if his followers did not believe that he could still be trusted. Alternatively, in Season 7, Episode 14, Gregory expresses concern to Simon over being on thin ice, stating,
I'm a can-do guy, but I gotta hang on to my people's trust, otherwise you don't know who might take over. Someone else might not be so cooperative.
But once legitimacy and trustworthiness have been established as precursors to authority, how should authority be handled? That's where coercion comes into play. Coercion refers to the enforcement of authority. It is the act of bending somebody else's will to your decree so that you can accomplish more than you would otherwise be able to accomplish on just your own. This is best illustrated by Negan in the opening scene of the Season 7 premiere, in which he remarks that having a right-hand man is important because,
I mean, what do you have left without him? A whole lot of work.
coercion is essential for a strong, effective leader because if you lack the assertiveness necessary to get people to obey you, you'll be perceived as weak and spineless, and thus nobody will take you seriously. The end result? A disorganized, non-functioning group. The governor perfectly illustrates this point in 713, stating,
You've moved into our backyard, you've shot up Main Street. If I let that threat persist, I look weak, and the whole thing crumbles.
It takes on many dimensions, but is most successful when enforced through physical violence. One intriguing question is, how was Negan able to build a community so large that it extends to multiple outposts? The answer is simple: fear. In Season 6, Episode 12, Glenn examines 20 photos of men and women with their heads brutally bashed in, a fate that he too will meet just 5 episodes later. Each of these deaths, along with the deaths of both Glenn and Abraham in 701, served a purpose in traumatizing outsiders so deeply that they were Stockholmed into working for Negan and ultimately becoming saviors themselves, thereby enlarging his group and strengthening his support network. The discussion between Negan and Sasha in Season 7, Episode 16 even suggests that by taking a life from each new community that the saviors have encountered, they have risen to prominence. Negan states,
Punishment is how we built everything we have.
as Mare Dugan writes in her essay entitled Coercive Power, the slave who is whipped may return to work, at least make the attempt to show compliance while the overseer is watching, and try to avoid additional lashes. In the struggle for dominance, the act of physically coercive punishments eliminates undesired behaviors and reproduces desired behaviors, while the threat of physically coercive punishment sustains the latter. Further breaking down the definition of power in the context of The Walking Dead, objectives can be anything from gathering food and gasoline on a routine supply run, to diverting a herd of walkers, to going to war with the saviors. Whatever these objectives may be, it is ultimately the responsibility of the leader to secure the short and long-term survival of their group. And if they are unable to accomplish this task, they have no business being in the leadership position to begin with. But what about obscurities of power? How do we decide who gets to lead over us in the absence of a government to control for who wields the awesome responsibility of saving and defending people's lives? Well, because humans are the only animals on the planet that associate with each other in a very rigid, very hierarchical fashion, they naturally gravitate toward positions of power even without rules and formal sanctions in place to dictate how it should be managed. We've seen many times throughout the show that the lack of a government precipitates humanity's regression to violent and destructive behavior as a means of establishing authority, with characters constantly struggling to figure out who's in charge through physical aggression. For instance, in Season 1, Episode 2, Merle rejects T-Dog's leadership by calling him a racial slur, provoking a violent altercation that leads to Merle drawing a gun on an incapacitated T-Dog. Merle then attempts to assert control over the group, but Rick intervenes by beating and chaining him to a pipe, which, in a roundabout way, asserts his control over the group. In Season 2, Episode 10, Rick and Shane quarrel over who is best equipped to keep Lori and Carl safe. Similarly, in 407, when Martinez suggests that he is incapable of keeping Lily and her daughter safe, the governor reacts by kicking Martinez off the trailer and dragging him to his death. The next day, the governor kills Pete inside of his own trailer and declares himself as the new leader of the campsite. The main takeaway from everything that I've discussed in this segment is that while everyone is certainly capable of leadership, not everyone is born a natural leader. The most successful leaders, then, are the ones who think constructively, make sensitive decisions reasonably and respectably, and prioritize the needs of others over the needs of themselves. Characters who fail to meet these criteria almost always wind up dead. They do not, in fact, bring civilization back to the world.
This world drives one mad.
People have lived through every kind of misery. Tyrants, genocide, systems of quiet hate, while others enjoy freedom on the same piece of land. Yet this, how we must exist now. It is mere luck we are not all insane.
We psychology majors don't like using the word crazy to describe somebody who's lost their sanity. And we certainly don't subscribe to the notion that sanity is something that can be lost as though it were a television remote. Rather, we believe that sanity is something that can be afflicted, much like our bodies can be afflicted by infectious diseases. Our minds, just like our bodies, must be constantly nurtured and regulated to function as nature intended. But before we can understand what sanity means in The Walking Dead, we need to take a step back and examine issues of stability versus change. An ongoing debate in the field of psychology is the relative permanence versus impermanence of personality characteristics that are pertinent to the formation of identity. Researchers to this day remain torn on the roles that genes in the environment play in the predictability of human behavior. Despite all of the back and forth, it's clear that identity and personality are interchangeable, with identity being the sum of every belief, value, attitude, and worldview, and personality being the representation of identity. What is unclear is the degree to which identity and personality change throughout the human lifespan. Some characters believe that who you were before, and who you are during, the zombie apocalypse is who you always will be. Deanna in particular believes that who you were before the zombie apocalypse is critical in determining your usefulness as a member of her community, implying to Rick in Season 5, Episode 12 that the walls surrounding Alexandria never would have been built without her husband Reg, who was once a professor of architecture. For example, in Season 2, Episode 11, Andrea and Dale argue about how to deal with Randall. Dale reminds Andrea that she is a civil rights lawyer, and that they do not need to kill Randall on the off chance that he informs his people of the farm's location. Additionally, in Season 5, Episode 1, Glenn expresses to Rick that they can remain altruistic even in the midst of all the incendiary chaos and carnage, stating,
We gotta let those people out. That's still who we are. It's gotta be.
To their dismay, Rick and the others released one of the bandits that originally attacked Terminus. The point still stands in that if Rick's people lost touch with who they were previously, they wouldn't be much different from the cannibals they so vehemently condemn. In Season 5, Episode 12, when Deanna appoints Rick as the local constable, she reminds him of who he was and who he is, plain and simple, a defender of law and order. She states,
That's what you were. That's what you are.
Morgan makes a similar comment in Season 6, Episode 1, when reflecting on his friendship with Rick. In a flashback, he states,
You were that man Carter in the armory. That's you. You still the same man I met in King County, the one that came back and told me it wasn't over. That was you. Same you that's right in front of me right now.
So what's the takeaway here? While there is a degree of consistency in our personalities, as noted by Dale, Glenn, Deanna, and Morgan, they can shift according to the environment that we live in. Take, for instance, Rick Grimes again. As the series progresses, he becomes a darker and more savage character, committing increasingly depraved acts to protect his people. In Season 2, Episode 11, Rick hesitates to kill Randall, but in Season 5, killing has become second nature to him. The end result is that the Rick that we see in the beginning of the series is almost nothing like the Rick that we see in Season 5 and beyond, with every person that he kills along his journey a testament to the darker side of the human race, and a contributing factor to his current trust issues. However, when the mind deteriorates, personality, and by extension identity, can break down until they are hardly recognizable from before. But what constitutes a deterioration of the human mind? How do we know when someone has gone crazy? The answer to these questions is contingent on three factors: the mind's exposure to abject trauma, the frequency and severity of trauma that the mind is exposed to, and how the mind responds to trauma. Not everyone responds to trauma in the same way because not everyone has a strong grasp on their emotions. By this logic, characters who have been exposed to prolonged, severe psychological stress, and who have not yet devised adequate mechanisms for coping with it, usually end up killing themselves or other people. For example, in Season 4, Episode 1, Rick encounters a filthy, despondent woman named Clara in the forest. Clara leads him back to her campsite to meet her husband Eddie, telling the story of the time that she was driven out of an airport by the undead. When Rick arrives at the woman's campsite, it turns out that Eddie had been deceased all along. Clara attacks Rick with a knife and ends up stabbing herself in the stomach. In Season 3, Episode 12, a deranged Morgan Jones, who previously helped Rick recover from his coma, opens fire on Rick, Carl, and Michonne. The cause of Morgan's derangement is later revealed to be his son Dwayne's preventable death, as Morgan had witnessed his own undead wife eat him alive. In Season 6, Episode 4, Morgan kills every living person that he encounters, and attempts to kill Eastman before getting himself under control. Additional examples of characters losing their grasps on reality are Beth, the Governor, Gareth, and Sasha. In Season 2, Episode 9, the shock of getting attacked by her own zombified mother has rendered Beth catatonic. And in Episode 210, she attempts to kill herself with a broken shard of glass. In Season 3, Episode 16, the Governor snaps and guns down his own people in a fit of seething rage. In 501, we learn that Terminus was once a peaceful community, but that Gareth and his people resorted to cannibalism after a band of marauders committed unspeakable atrocities against them. Finally, in Season 5, Episode 13, Deanna's welcome party triggers viscerally traumatic memories of the deaths of Tyrese, Bob, and Beth and Sasha, causing her to lash out at another Alexandrian and abruptly storm off. One episode later, Sasha leaves Alexandria and hunts down walkers all day as a distraction from her psychic pain. Even Rick himself loses his grasp on reality after learning that his wife, Lori, died in childbirth, and that Carl shot her in the head to prevent zombification. He abandons his responsibility as a leader and father to his new daughter, Judith, takes his frustration out on walkers, and hallucinates Lori's voice over the phone for almost an entire episode. Rick further experiences visual hallucinations of his deceased wife, but unlike other characters, his mind eventually reverts back to normalcy and he is able to lead his people again. While the zombie apocalypse certainly did not strip these characters of their sanity, the various horrors of the zombie apocalypse eroded their sanity so much they detached from reality and became dangerous. The question remains as to whether the mind, having suffered enough stress already, crosses a point of no return. A prominent theme throughout Season 4 is the possibility of recuperating from insanity, or coming back.
Do you think you get to come back from them?
You get to come back, you do.
Some things you just can't come back from.
We get to come back.
Unfortunately, characters who acknowledge that they've gone off the deep end and therefore adjust some aspect about themselves that they want to change, almost always regress to the state that they were in when making the adjustment. Two examples of this phenomenon are the Governor and Morgan Jones. In Season 4, Episode 6, the Governor, disgusted by his recent behavior, aimlessly wanders around for several months and eventually meets the Chambler family. He then attempts to atone for his past crimes, such as retrieving 2 oxygen tanks for Lily and Tara's sick, dying father. The audience begins to suspect that perhaps the Governor is a redeemable character. But in Season 4, Episode 7, his attempts at leaving behind his past fail, and he ultimately succumbs to his dark nature. Likewise, Morgan Jones spends almost 2 seasons honoring Eastman's all life is precious policy. However, after the death of Benjamin in Season 7, Episode 13, Morgan strangles Richard to death, relapses into his clear state, and permits himself to kill the saviors. But what do you think? Do we get to come back, or are we all too far gone? I'll let you decide that for yourselves.
All life is precious. And that idea changed me. It brought me back, and it keeps me living.
I just don't think it can be that easy.
It's not easy.
I wasn't saying that.
I know. And I've thought about letting that idea go. But I don't want to.
Every day, characters must live in a world where the overwhelming majority of the human population is dead, society has broken down beyond recognition, and the possibility of getting eaten alive by the undead is very real. There must be plenty of compelling incentives to commit suicide, right? Not necessarily. Consider Albert Camus, the founder of modern absurdism, who believed that the meaning of life is intrinsically unknowable and that as such, there is a certain futility in the human quest to achieve meaning. According to Camus, absurdism constitutes a fundamental philosophical problem in that if life truly is meaningless, what is to stop us all from committing suicide? The solution to this problem is two-pronged. First, We can solve the problem through our understanding that suicide is a byproduct of the human mind's increased awareness of its own finite and futile existence, as we do not see other animals performing acts of self-termination simply because they do not register a point to living. It could be that while nature never intended for us to ask these complex questions such as, why are we here, or what is the meaning of life, our language and culture have equipped us with an enhanced capacity to provide answers to them, and consequently commit suicide when we perceive said answers to be insufficient. Second, we can solve the problem by liberating ourselves from life's intrinsic unknowability and manufacturing our own meaning. Religion is the primary instrument in manufacturing meaning because A, it denies the finiteness of life, and B, offers justifications of its absurdities. Simultaneously, all meaning is self-referential in that it does not necessitate religion or a devotement to a god. This is best indicated by Rick in Season 2, Episode 1, when he admits that he was never a strong believer in God, and instead placed his faith in his wife, friends, and job. Non-religious characters in The Walking Dead manufacture their own meaning by harboring and preaching a unique maxim, or a motto. You can think of it as being similar to a slogan for a presidential campaign, like Donald Trump's 2016 campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." Alternatively, Rick and Michonne's motto is,
"We're the ones who live."
Gareth's is,
"You're either the butcher or the cattle."
Morgan's are,
"I have to clear."
And
all life is precious.
Enid's is,
"Just survive somehow."
King Ezekiel's is,
"Drink from the well, replenish the well."
Negan's is,
"You earn what you take."
Jadis's is,
"We take, we don't bother."
Are you noticing a pattern yet? All of these characters operate on some core, personalized doctrine that helps them deal with the zombie apocalypse in different ways. Let's gauge the meaning of each of these maxims. Rick and Michonne's maxim that they are the ones who live preaches their perseverance in the zombie apocalypse, despite the numerous occasions when they could have easily died or given up. It reflects their supremacy over the weaker, more cowardly, and more inept survivors, and reminds themselves that they are always the ones who come out on top. Gareth's maxim that you're either the butcher or the cattle preaches this hunt or be hunted logic of sorts, with Terminus believing that it is essential to prey on and cannibalize those who might threaten their livelihood. Morgan's maxim is a special case. It changes from I have to clear in Season 3 to all life is precious in Season 6. Quote, I have to clear, unquote, reflects Morgan's nihilistic struggle to live with a clear conscience after inadvertently causing the death of his son Dwayne. While, quote, all life is precious, unquote, another maxim adopted from Morgan's former mentor, Eastman, reflects his regard for the inherent value that can be found in all human beings, including the ones who do not deserve to live. Morgan therefore goes from killing everyone within a 5-mile radius to killing no one, with the former and latter both a function of his philosophy on killing. The meaning behind Enid's maxim, just survive somehow, is simple. Survive by any means necessary. Negan's maxim, you earn what you take, illustrates that hard work pays off. King Ezekiel's maxim, drink from the well, replenish the well, means that you should only take from the kingdom as much as you give back to it. Finally, Jadis's maxim, we take, we don't bother, illustrates the preference of her group to distance itself from the affairs of other communities, unless it can strike the best possible deal with them and gain something in return. By now, you can probably see how there is some overlap between sanity and philosophy, as characters whose lives are devoid of a reason to challenge the zombie apocalypse often resort to suicide. This poses the question, does a lack of sanity diminish meaning? Or does a lack of meaning diminish sanity? Recall the characters Dr. Jenner, Nicholas, Beth, and Abraham. Two examples of characters who acquainted themselves with the prospect of suicide, and were successful at committing it, are Dr. Jenner and Nicholas. In Season 1, Episode 6, Dr. Jenner, the last remaining survivor of the CDC, opts out of existence like his coworkers did, rationalizing that it is pointless to delay fate any longer, especially when everyone will die an agonizing death sooner or later. In Season 6, Episode 3, after being confronted with the impossibility of the situation that he's found himself in, Nicholas shoots himself in the head and pulls Glenn down with him. By contrast, in Season 2, Episode 10, Beth is so perturbed by the death of her mother that she has ostensibly lost all will to survive. She attempts to commit suicide in the absence of Maggie and Lori, but changes her mind when she realizes the people that she would be letting down if she went through with it. In addition, Season 5, Episode 5 reveals in a flashback that Abraham was about to shoot himself in the head. However, Eugene's special mission to Washington gave him a reason to live. The difference between these two pairs of characters lies in how open-minded they were to prolonging their survival. Jenner and Nicholas were closed-minded. They expected to find peace by removing themselves from existence, yet paradoxically made peace unattainable by depriving themselves of the opportunity to experience it. Beth and Abraham were at least able to grow as characters in choosing to stay alive. Indeed, the complete loss of hope is the most powerful motivator in the decision to commit suicide. But it remains condemnable because there are still people around to depend on us. Maggie depended on Beth because family still mattered to her, while Eugene depended on Abraham because he was unfit to survive on his own. Rick, Tyrese, and Rosita make this notion of dependability quite clear. For example, in Season 2, Episode 9, Rick attempts to dissuade Herschel from drinking himself to death, scrutinizing him for his selfish behavior and explaining that it doesn't matter if they believe that life has become hopeless. Because what matters most, the only thing that matters, is ensuring the survival of the group back at the farm. In addition, Tyrese expresses to Noah in Season 5, Episode 9, that, in retrospect, he never would have been able to save Judith if he had given up. Finally, in 602, Spencer asks Rosita how she can possibly go on living if there are people like the wolves in the world who will kill for sport, to which she responds with saying that if you expect to go on living in such a messed up world, you need to make sure that you have someone worth dying for. The main takeaway here is that the zombie apocalypse reinforces but never exaggerates the absurd. While characters can lose their loved ones quite easily and abruptly, upon enough reflection, the world they're living in is not much different from before in terms of the absurdity that they are presented with. Just listen to Rick's lecture.
You know what the truth is? Nothing has changed. Death is death. It's always been there. Whether it's from heart attack, cancer, or a walker, what's the difference?
And so, all characters can do is defy the absurd to the best of their abilities, and manufacture beliefs that not only help them make sense of the zombie apocalypse, but give them a reason to wage an ongoing fight for their survival.
It's not charity. You have to have numbers. People are the best defense against walkers, or people. We help each other.
As humans, we are naturally reliant on each other to meet our survival needs. It would be erroneous of us to assume that we're better off alone, because we've been primed by our biology to be social creatures, and therefore help one another in sickness, starvation and dehydration, and injury. With that being said, The Walking Dead makes it abundantly clear that characters who do not associate with, and fight alongside, a group are usually the first to die. In this manner, the most powerful weapon in the zombie apocalypse is not an axe, a wrench, or even a gun, but instead a community. A group of people who occupy the same space at the same time, and are united by shared common identities and objectives. Every community operates on three key principles that secure both the rights and well-being of its members. The first principle is that it is exclusive, as you cannot walk into any community and expect to immediately become a member of it without at least passing a few tests first. For example, whenever Rick encounters an unfamiliar group of survivors, he inquires as to how many walkers they've killed, how many people they've killed, and why. This spontaneous interview is conducted to determine the extent to which they are trustworthy, helpful, and harmful before taking the risk of accepting them into his fold. Similarly, Deanna interviews Rick and his people to verify that they are non-threatening and thus admissible to join Alexandria. In addition, Tyrese pledges to the governor to earn his keep, or prove his worth to him to earn a respectable place in Woodbury. Later, Martinez will only accept the governor into the river camp on the condition that he acknowledges his leadership and contributes to the community. He states,
"Contribute or be cast out."
Lastly, Negan's recruits are required to relinquish their identities and adopt his own. while the wolves are required to either write or carve W's onto their foreheads as part of a twisted initiation. The second principle of every community is that it is structured by rules, rituals, boundaries, and hierarchies. For a moment, let's try to understand what the purpose of each of these components is, and how they all culminate into a community. Rules set standards for acceptable versus unacceptable behavior, and therefore punish wrongdoing in the event that a transgression has occurred. Recall from my discussion on power the violent, dictatorial leadership style of Negan, whose stringent rules forbid disobedience, dissension, rape, and the failure to deliver resources every week. The show hasn't explained why the Saviors take these rules so seriously, but the comic miniseries Here's Negan by Robert Kirkman can provide us some clues. It suggests that they were created as preventative measures against incompetence and stupidity, as Negan had witnessed multiple people get themselves killed either because they didn't know what they were doing, or because they made exceptionally poor decisions. When Negan discovered that his baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire named Lucille was effective in evoking fear and intimidation, he subsequently adopted it as a morbid form of punishment. Negan even explains in Season 7, Episode 7, that rules must exist in some capacity, because without them, people die. Alternatively, Joe's rules were created to both prevent and resolve conflicts between his men. He explains to Daryl in Season 4, Episode 15 that all members are required to announce, or claim, ownership of an item before someone else does if they want to keep it. They must also never tell a lie, otherwise they will receive a beating as punishment. Joe further professes that,
when men like us follow rules and cooperate a little bit, well, the world becomes ours.
Rituals create a sense of familiarity in a community by not only bringing its members closer together, but by distracting them from the anxieties of everyday life. One example of a ritual can be found in Season 3, Episode 5, where the governor hosts a gladiator fight between Merle and Martinez in an arena surrounded by chained walkers. Andrea, appalled by the barbaric nature of the attraction, wishes to be no part of it. But the governor rationalizes to her that it's just a way for his people to blow off steam, and that the entire event is staged. Andrea then protests that he's teaching his people that the walkers are not dangerous, and he objects by saying that he's teaching them not to be afraid. Boundaries prevent outsiders from accessing a community's land, food, and natural resources. Understandably, you wouldn't let just anyone walk into your house without at least knocking first. By that logic, the walls of Alexandria were erected as physical boundaries protecting the community from walkers and hostile survivors. In Season 6, Episode 1, after Rick learns about Morgan's encounter with the wolves, he expresses to Daryl that they need to increase security measures by setting up more watch points around the perimeter. Rick also relieves Daryl and Aaron from their responsibility as recruiters, reasoning that they should not risk bringing in dangerous people who would only try to eradicate their community if given the chance. Rick justifies Daryl and Aaron's suspension when he states that,
well, people out there, they gotta take care of themselves, just like us.
Further illustrating that human communities operate independently from one another, and by extension, are not responsible for one another's safety. Hierarchies establish a fluidity in power so that one or more individuals do not hold too much of it over another. The Saviors operate on a strict hierarchy, with Negan of course being at the top of the chain of command. His lieutenants consist of sentries and guards, and carry out his orders by leading missions to other communities. Simon is the subordinate and immediate replacement of Negan if he were to die. Under Negan, his lieutenants, and Simon, are the inhabitants of the sanctuary, who work to earn points that are then exchanged for an assortment of commodities. And at the absolute bottom of the power chain are the prisoners, detainees, and objectors of the Savior's regime. Meanwhile, in the comic series, the Whisperer's hierarchy dictates that Alpha is at the top of the chain of command, and that Beta is the second in command to Alpha. The third principle of every community is that it behaves differently according to the cultures, values, worldviews, religions, and past experiences shared by its members. We've met many communities in The Walking Dead that vary in size, but no two of them always conduct their business in the same way. For example, the governor and his men plunder camps, killing multiple innocent survivors on sight and scavenging their food, supplies, and weaponry. He also orders his men to dig holes in the nearby fields for entrapping and imprisoning walkers, which are then appropriated as weapons against the prison and repurposed for entertainment. The wolves kill and entrap unsuspecting survivors, seize their supplies, and then utilize them as bait after they zombify. The saviors overpower and intimidate other communities into providing half of their resources every week. And finally, in the comic series, the Whisperers disguise themselves with the flesh of walkers and hunt down anyone who oversteps into their territory. Ultimately, high-functioning communities form institutions, or what we think of in the pre-apocalypse as large, cohesive organizations consisting of schools, restaurants, grocery stores, government bureaus, law enforcement agencies, and essentially any office that you can think of. Several examples of institutions in The Walking Dead are Terminus, Alexandria, and the Sanctuary. We see in 501 that Gareth has institutionalized the practice of draining the blood of new arrivals, and then prepping them for cannibalism, adding a controlled, calculated, and almost managerial spin on what we would consider a horrific act. Listen to Gareth's textbook bureaucratic lingo.
You have 2 hours to get them on the dryers, then we go back to public face. Now's the time we can get messy, but we need to dial it all in by sundown.
Got it.
Yes, sir.
Alexandria and the Sanctuary could be thought of as self-sufficient institutions in their own regards, whereby each of their inhabitants are appointed with respective roles, jobs, and responsibilities that fulfill everyone's survival needs. As Dawn argues in 504, anytime you're part of an institution, there are certain expectations that correspond to the role in which you've stepped into, and that you are obligated to fulfill. She states,
"In here, you are part of a system. The wards keep my officers happy. The happier my officers are, the harder they work to keep us going."
But what might these expectations be? At Alexandria, for example, the local constables are expected to maintain order and stability. The cooks plan, coordinate, and prepare daily meals. The guards defend the walls and keep an eye out for walkers. The runners scavenge food and supplies. And the recruiters take in new community members. The main takeaway here is that when everyone does what's expected of them, and the moving parts within institutions come together, society starts anew, and the world feels like it never ended.
The key to survival is allowing oneself to be shaped by the assigned environment. In doing so, a broad range of capabilities are required, allowing one to flip the script and use said capabilities to shape said environment for maximum longevity. I'm saying I'm in the process of said stage 2. I've changed, adapted. I'm a survivor.
The classic phrase, survival of the fittest, could not be any more relevant to the world of The Walking Dead. With the zombie apocalypse rebalancing humanity by selecting against weak individuals and promoting survival for the stronger, more intelligent, and more resourceful. Strength, or the ability to resist, challenge, and overcome adversity, is therefore one of the show's principal themes, with characters often dying prematurely as a result of their unchecked arrogance, fear, and all-around incompetence. Rick and Glenn would argue that psychological weakness is a hazard and not a benefit. For instance, in 515, Glenn confronts Nicholas about leaving behind Noah at the facility, stating that people like him are supposed to be dead, but that the walls went up just in time, so he is not. And in 601, Rick explains to Morgan that despite wanting to kill Carter, he didn't need to because people like him will die no matter what. Quite poetically, Carter dies in the next scene. So how is strength a factor in surviving the zombie apocalypse? Consider Season 7, Episode 1. After brutally bashing in the heads of both Glenn and Abraham, Negan puts Rick's vigor to the ultimate test. As if the trauma of losing 2 of his closest friends to a vicious sociopath with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire wasn't enough, a broken down, exhausted Rick is instructed to retrieve an axe in a crowd of walkers. Negan's rationale is that if Rick can follow orders and demonstrate his vigor by pushing through his grief and hatred, then perhaps he's worth his time. He asks Rick to think about what happened, what could have happened, and what could still happen, prompting him to ruminate on the horrors that he just observed, and to imagine the other survivors getting struck by Lucille if he failed in his task. Rick manages to ultimately grab the axe and deliver it to Negan. This scene attests to Rick Grimes as the show's strongest character, who powers through abject, earth-shattering traumas even when he doesn't have the time to properly grieve over them. Take, for instance, the death of his wife, Lori, in Season 3, Episode 4. Having spent almost 3 episodes trying to make sense of this profound loss, Rick is forced back into reality when the governor assaults the prison in 310. Strength is therefore contingent upon adaptability, or the capacity to accommodate for unforeseen circumstances. Characters lacking in adaptive capabilities are the residents of Alexandria, who have literally and figuratively resided within a comfort zone since the beginning of the outbreak, and are thus unequipped to hold their own. For example, in 512, Aiden confronts Glenn about refusing to follow his instructions after Tara is nearly killed. Glenn accuses Aiden of incompetence, but Aiden assures him that he knows what he's doing. 2 episodes later, Aiden accidentally impales himself to the wall from a grenade explosion, and in his final moments, confesses to Glenn that it was he who caused the deaths of his previous 4 supply runners, stating,
The others before. They didn't panic. We did. It was us.
He proceeds to die a horrible, gruesome death while Glenn, Noah, and Nicholas escape from the facility, only to get trapped in a revolving door. In a panicked attempt at self-preservation, Nicholas then shoves himself through the door before Glenn can break the glass and free Noah. Glenn watches in terror as Noah is ripped to shreds right in front of his very eyes. In the same episode, Abraham is helping Tobin's construction crew to gather building materials for the expansion of the wall. The group is suddenly caught off guard and ambushed by multiple walkers, at which point Francine, the crew's designated watcher, falls and sprains her ankle. Tobin freezes and seemingly leaves her for dead, but Abraham steps up and saves her life. Additionally, in Season 6, Episode 2, Spencer cowers in fear and hides in the truck to wait out the wolf attack. Negan himself can see through Spencer's weakness in 708, when Spencer tries to persuade him into murdering Rick so that he can instate leadership over Alexandria. Negan wonders why, if he wants Rick dead so badly, Spencer doesn't just kill him himself, and then states that it's because he's
got no guts.
He proceeds to shove a knife through Spencer's abdomen and allow his intestines to spill everywhere. Clearly, the Alexandria safe zone is a fool's paradise, with its residents' blatant inexperience evidenced by their propensity to endanger both themselves and Rick's people. Carol and Carl even complain to Rick about the prospect of becoming overly habituated to indulging in the luxuries of Alexandria, so much that the survivors soften up and lose touch with the skills that they have acquired while on the outside. To remedy this issue, Rick expresses to Deanna that his people need to train the Alexandrians on how to combat walkers. But as we see in 601, their cowardice supersedes their competency and Rick must once again intervene on their behalf. By contrast, adaptable characters include Carol, Eugene, and Father Gabriel. Beginning with Carol, in Season 1, she is presented as a powerless and passive character, allowing her husband Eddie to abuse her without standing up for herself. By 501, Carol displays remarkable resourcefulness when she assaults Terminus with a bottle rocket, saving Rick, Glenn, and Daryl from cannibalization. Similarly, in 602, she dresses up as one of the wolves and hunts them down. Key instances of Carol's transformation throughout the series are marked by the deaths of Ed and Sophia in Seasons 1 and 2, secretly killing Karen and David to prevent the spread of an aggressive flu virus in Season 4, and killing Lizzie to protect Judith and Tyrese. One might even suspect that her progression as a character outpaces that of Rick Grimes. As Rick initially exiled her in Season 4 for quarantining the prison against his prerogative, but admits to Morgan in 515,
If it happened today, I'd thank her. Or I would have killed her myself. She was right to do it.
Despite her calloused exterior, Carol is not without a conscience, as she does not enjoy the act of killing but does it anyway because she feels like she has to. Also, recall Eugene Porter, who initially wouldn't go anywhere near a walker, and instead rely on his group to safeguard him. Eugene openly acknowledges and accepts his cowardice, as Tara asks him in 514 if he is as much of a coward as he says he is, and he responds with,
Yes, I am. I told you I was.
However, we see later on that Eugene overcomes his pervasive fear when he carries Tara to safety, and kills his first walkers. Almost like a dog that learns how to swim under the desperation to escape the pool that it's just been thrown into. Eugene continues to display signs of adaptability, such as driving the RV to lure the Saviors in Season 6, Episode 16, and assimilating into the Sanctuary compound under Negan's rule in Season 7, Episode 11. Finally, Father Gabriel was a timid, easily frightened, and duplicitous man in Season 5, who went behind Rick's back to inform Deanna that she has let bad people into Alexandria. However, his character, too, begins the process of transformation into an empowered, determined survivor when he seeks absolution for betraying Rick's trust. He asks Carl to train him on how to operate a gun, steps up during the Walker Herd crisis, offers to look after Judith in Rick's absence, and terminates a stray savior.
Amen.
The main takeaway here is that while it feels good to be inside of a comfort zone, it is unsustainable in the long term because it manufactures the illusion of safety when we are far from it. By constantly putting themselves into situations that they are uncomfortable with, characters adapt to the zombie apocalypse accordingly and improve their survivorship skills overall.
I still think there's a plan. I still believe there's a reason.
You think it's all a test?
Life was always a test, Rick.
Overall, we are already living in the apocalypse because issues of power, sanity, philosophy, community, and strength are issues that we must all deal with, even in an operational society. That is, we are always going to struggle with who gets to make sensitive decisions on our behalf, how well we respond to incidences of acute stress, where we derive a sense of meaning and purpose, who we spend time with and confide in, and how we compensate for hardship. Just as everyone has a Rick Grimes in their life, if they look hard enough, they'll unfortunately find a Negan. Perhaps you're oppressed by a manager who's overworked and underpaid you, or live in fear of an abusive spouse who beats you for not having cooked dinner on time. The relationships between us and our children, parents, spouses, managers, teachers, government bureaucrats, and friends are therefore fraught with power struggles. It is important for us to realize that at the core of human nature is the need for dominance, and that whoever controls our behavior controls our very livelihood. But what if your manager overworks and underpays you into disgruntlement? What if your spouse beats you so many times that you decide to suffocate him or her in the middle of the night with a pillow? That's where sanity comes into the question. Everyone has their limits mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Everyone can be pushed so far to the brink that they in effect lose it and diffuse their frustration into themselves or loved ones. We've seen that Walking Dead characters who have been exposed to enough death, decay, and physical violence forget what life was like before the dead took over, and thus resort to murder or suicide. Similarly, foot soldiers who have fought on the battlefield long enough forget what it's like to be away from the battlefield, and thus can no longer make the distinguishment between the sensations of war and the comforts of their own homes. As a consequence, we hear on the news of war veterans who are afflicted by PTSD committing suicide. But despite being pushed to the brink, despite the pain extending from the failure, trauma, and defeat that life puts us through, it is possible for us to make a modicum of sense of it. We now live in a world filled with increasing pessimism, where terrorist attacks and prospects of nuclear war have become commonplace and almost procedural. A world where, if you're a young adult trying to live independently, you can work over 60 hours a week but barely make enough money to even put bread on the table. In that respect, the zombie apocalypse is not really a step down from our current fast-paced, demanding, and anxiety-laden lives. Much like Walking Dead characters are averted by the undead, we are averted by the disturbances of the modern world, including terrorism, the prospect of nuclear war, widespread poverty and disease, and overpopulation. At the same time, through our interpretation of these disturbances, and our interpretation of the suffering that follows, we can stop feeling threatened and start feeling encouraged by them. However, we don't always have to do that alone, as we often depend on each other for sources of comfort. Communities provide us with a support system with which to confide in when life has gotten the better of us. We can find them at the local church, school, bar, or workplace. We can even find them in our own households. However, not all communities will always be suited to our liking, so we need to be patient until we finally discover one that we fit in with. Once we've done that, something as simple as grabbing a couple of beers with a good friend could go a long way in strengthening connections between each other and promoting survival and wellness. Yet we also need to make sure that we don't become too comfortable. You know how it is. You work the same 9-to-5 job for the rest of your life because you're too afraid of change. You don't want to accept that opportunistic promotion because you doubt that you could ever handle the responsibility attached to it. As a result, you stop growing. You stagnate. The Walking Dead reminds us that it is fruitless to remain in these comfort zones that we've created for ourselves. Because sooner or later, reality catches up to us and we must either adapt to hardship or allow it to consume us indefinitely. Zombies or no zombies, issues of power, sanity, philosophy, community, and strength will always factor into our day-to-day lives. Each is a piece of the same complex puzzle that is the human condition. How we handle them determines the kinds of survivors that we are right now, and the kinds of survivors that we would be in an insane world such as The Walking Dead.